They say the dark is quiet, but I don't think it is. Sometimes it listens back. Where are you right now? And what time is it where you are? Leave it in the comments. Just try to stay still. Sometimes the quiet moves. 5 nights a week, the night shift at a 24-hour gas station had been worked without complaint. The air inside had always carried the same scent: burnt coffee, motor oil, and the faint sweetness of cheap air fresheners that clung to the walls like mildew. Across the street stood the dead, the bones of a town buried in time, sealed beneath the black wrought iron of Tremont Hill Cemetery. No visitors had come after sunset. The gates had rusted shut decades ago. The wind there had moved differently, low and circular, as if always returning to the same spot. On the night of March 19th, the shift had begun like any other. The hum of fluorescent lights had flickered above. Refrigerated doors had hissed each time a soda was taken. The graveyard across the road had sat unmoving, a silhouette beneath the half-lit sky. It had started around 2:10 a.m. One police cruiser had been noticed first, parking slowly outside the cemetery gates, then another, then more. Within an hour, 10 vehicles had lined the road, headlights cutting across headstones like searchlights in fog. The cashier on duty, Gabe, had watched from behind the counter. His break had come and gone, and yet no movement had occurred beyond the line of cruisers. Officers had spoken quietly beneath the trees. Flashlights had passed over graves, but no answers had been shouted. No perimeter tape had been strung. Stillness had been maintained, and with it, an eerie waiting. As the shift neared its end, the glass doors had opened. A man in uniform had entered. Not hurried, not frantic. Calm, too calm. He had asked questions. How long had the cameras recorded? What angles had been captured? Could footage be retrieved from 60 days ago? When asked why, no explanation had been given. The request had been marked official, but the tone had suggested urgency beneath the surface. Something had been found, and it had not been meant to be seen. The next morning, curiosity had spread through the town like wildfire. Locals had speculated. Online chatter had begun. No statement had been issued by police. Rumors had filled the void, and slowly, fragments of truth had begun to surface. A regular customer, one who lingered often by the coffee machine and spoke little, had returned that evening and shared a whispered detail. A suitcase had been discovered, not new, not old, found beside the cemetery's northern fence line. It had remained there for weeks. Dog walkers had passed it. No one had opened it, until someone finally had. At first, authorities had believed it might contain discarded food, or perhaps evidence of illegal dumping. What had been revealed had been far worse. Inside the suitcase had been a woman's torso, wrapped in a plastic garbage bag, her remains folded into the narrow space, as though packed like cargo. The local coroner had transported the body to a medical examiner across the state. Investigators had sealed the scene and rerouted traffic. Still, no announcement had been made. No faces had been shown on the news. But rumors had grown teeth. Online sleuths had connected the discovery to older unsolved cases. Murders from nearby towns had been cited, timelines constructed, and maps drawn. A pattern had been claimed. People had whispered of a serial killer, and inside the gas station, under the buzzing lights and behind the counter's smudged plexiglass, Gabe had begun to wonder if one of those faces, one of the many strangers he'd rung up at night, had belonged to the person responsible. By the second day, the police presence had lessened, but the silence had thickened. No official press conference had taken place. No photographs had circulated, but word of the torso had bled through the cracks, first whispered in parking lots, then shouted in online forums, before finally taking root in local community pages, where theories multiplied like mold. Inside the gas station, Gabe had continued his shifts as usual, but every customer now had become a potential threat. The man with the mechanic's hands, who always paid in quarters, the teenager with the camera, who never spoke, the woman who lingered too long outside the restrooms. Each one had been studied a little longer, watched a little closer. During slow hours, conversations had been had with regulars who waited at the bus stop near the cemetery. One of them, a woman with yellowing fingertips and a voice made of gravel, had been certain that the suitcase had been there for weeks, at least since early February. It had rested just beside a public trash can, unnoticed, unmoved. Others had recalled strange smells near that part of the road. Some had blamed the storm drains, others had said nothing, but their eyes had revealed the quiet guilt of those who had seen and chosen not to act. And then came April 3rd. Information had leaked through someone close to the investigation. The remains, it had been said, belonged to a woman between the ages of 45 and 65. Her body had shown signs of a rare genetic condition, Turner syndrome, a trait affecting growth and reproductive function. That detail had changed everything. It had narrowed the field. It had turned the anonymous remains into a possible name. By April 7th, a woman had contacted police, claiming the body might belong to her older sister, Janice Worley, age 59. No contact had been made since early January. That absence hadn't seemed too unusual until Janice had failed to call on her sister's birthday, something she had never once forgotten in over 30 years. A day later, a second relative had stepped forward. Same name, same missing dates. The pattern had begun to form. Police had searched records. A welfare check on Janice had been conducted back in October. At that time, she had answered the door herself. No issues had been noted, but in December another wellness check had been placed, not for Janice, but for her roommate, a 68-year-old man named Martin Hale. He had been battling stage 4 cancer and had reportedly stopped answering calls. That had been the last time anyone had been seen at their shared address on Torrance Street. And that name, Martin Hale, had not been unfamiliar to Gabe. In fact, he had served him more than once. A thin man, always wearing a coat no matter the season, with a rasp in his voice and a tendency to complain about tobacco regulations. He had once threatened a co-worker for refusing a sale without ID. State law had been clear, but Martin hadn't cared. Janice had been no better. She had panhandled outside the station so often she'd been banned. Once she had tried to spit on Gabe for asking her to leave. They had seemed like ghosts then, background characters in the blur of late-night shifts. Now they had become central. Nicholas Verren, a man who had occasionally driven Martin to appointments, had seen news reports about the torso, and something in him had stirred. He had come forward. He had spoken with the police, and what he revealed had turned rumor into horror. According to Nicholas, Martin had once confessed, half joking, half slurred, that Janice had been stealing from him $200 worth of crack cocaine. Allegedly, an argument had followed. Then silence. Nicholas had recalled the moment Martin had said she wouldn't be coming back. The tone had been off. The words had lingered. He had driven Martin around the time the suitcase had appeared. Worse yet, he had helped load it into his car. Nicholas Verren's confession had not come easily. He had told police the suitcase had felt unusually heavy, but at the time, no questions had been asked. Martin had appeared sick, thin as a whisper, with hands that trembled as if made of paper. The item had been described as luggage, placed carefully in the trunk. No stains had been visible. No odor had been noticed at first, but something had shifted during the drive. A scent had emerged, faint and strangely sweet. Not rot, not garbage. Something worse, a sweetness that belonged nowhere natural. The memory of that scent had been enough to unearth everything Nicholas had tried to forget. Martin had made statements during those rides, fragments of confession, pieces of something he likely hadn't meant to share. Words like problem solved, and they won't look for her. At the time, those phrases had sounded like anger, Now they had echoed like warnings ignored. As police began compiling evidence, a search warrant had been obtained for the apartment on Torrance Street. On April 18th, law enforcement had shut down the block for over 16 hours. Hazmat suits had entered. Evidence bags had emerged. Neighbors had watched in silence as officers filed in and out, their gloved hands stained with something dark beneath the artificial light. Inside, investigators had found a scene that no one had expected, and yet one that matched the worst fears. Blood-like residue had coated portions of the kitchen floor. A handsaw had been discovered beneath the sink. Behind a dresser, a baseball bat had been located, its surface crusted with what would later test positive for blood and strands of hair. And tucked into a black plastic trash bag, a mix of male and female clothing, each piece soaked in a red, rusted hue that no detergent could wash away. Martin Hale had not been home. He had been found at a nearby hospital, receiving treatment for his worsening cancer. His arrest had taken place in silence. According to the official report, he had not resisted. In fact, he had spoken first. "All right, man, I did it." Those words had cracked the case open. In detail, he had recounted what had happened. Janice had been struck in the head with a bat. The impact had been strong enough to split her skull. No remorse had been expressed. No emotion had colored the statement. Her body had remained on the floor for 5 days. He had walked around it, slept near it, ignored it. On the 6th day, she had been moved to the bed. That night, a hacksaw had been purchased. The next day, the dismemberment had begun. Her limbs and head had been wrapped in bags and discarded in a dumpster behind the very gas station where Gabe had continued to work. That dumpster, emptied twice a week, had fed into the city's incineration system. Nothing had been recovered. The torso had been too heavy to carry far, so it had been left right across the street near the cemetery fence line. According to Martin's own words, "I figured someone would find it and bury it." After the confession, the narrative that had taken root online of a serial killer weaving through towns in silence had begun to rot. The truth, though simpler, had been no less disturbing. Martin Hale had not been a shadowy drifter, not a face from distant headlines. He had been familiar, a man seen hundreds of times, in line at the register, complaining about prices, smelling of tobacco and sweat. He had belonged to the neighborhood the way a stain belongs to a floor, ignored until it darkens. The community had reacted with a kind of confused grief. Some had claimed they always knew something was off. Others had stayed quiet, stunned by the ordinariness of it all. The talk of a wider conspiracy had dried up. Police had confirmed that, despite Martin's criminal record stretching back to the 1990s, no evidence had linked him to the other deaths that had plagued nearby towns. The fires of panic had dimmed. The fear had changed shape, but the unease had remained, especially for Gabe. Every time the back door of the gas station had opened, the one that led to the dumpsters, the thought had returned. The mental image of bags too heavy, of flesh burning in the city's unseen furnaces, had refused to leave. He had walked that short stretch of pavement hundreds of times before, but now each step had felt like trespassing over a place that remembered. Even after weeks had passed, he had continued to spot the faces of strangers and wonder what they might be hiding. Which glances were rehearsed, which smiles were real. A few co-workers had left. Some had asked for day shifts. Gabe had stayed. He had kept working beneath those humming fluorescent lights, ringing up cigarettes and gas cans, watching the cemetery across the street, as if something else might rise from it again. The tree line had begun to bloom by early May. Wind had returned to the branches. Grass had started to recover in the patch where the suitcase had once rested. People had walked past again without noticing the shadow that lingered in the air. But Gabe had noticed, because every time the door chime had echoed, and someone new had stepped inside, He had remembered the way Martin used to lean on the counter, the way Janice had hovered by the doors, the way no one, not neighbors, not workers, not police, had seen it coming. And that, more than anything else, had stayed with him. Not the gore, not the headlines, not the bags of evidence, just this: how easily monsters had passed as regulars, and how they might be doing it still. No light had been seen for what might have been days, or weeks, or years. The boundaries of time had dissolved inside that rotting space, where the air had carried the scent of piss, rust, and old sweat. The walls had been stone, smeared with the grime of forgotten lives, and the floor had absorbed the weeping of men long since broken. He had once been called Reuben. Though that name had not been spoken aloud in so long, it had begun to feel foreign. The sound of it, once whispered in dreams by a wife and child, had faded under the relentless grind of metal and meat and blood. Each day had begun with the same ritual: the rough shove of a rifle butt to the spine, the rasp of a voice giving no name, and the bag, that bag, pulled tight over his skull, had become the closest thing to a home. Its suffocating darkness had offered a cruel sort of privacy, a brief moment where no eyes had seen him, and no one had spoken. The labor had taken place in a room where the walls sweated, where conveyor belts stretched like veins beneath buzzing overhead lights. Hands had been used to crush, to grind, to sort. No questions had been asked. No instructions had been given. The punishment for stopping had been administered without words, just the sound of boots and fists and groans swallowed by the concrete. Reuben's left arm had been lost long before. In its place, a splintered prosthetic had been fastened, too crude for precision, but strong enough to push through another shift. Each time it had struck the steel table, something inside had fractured, metal, bone, or mind. It had become hard to say. Others had worked alongside him, shapes bent by exhaustion, faces unrecognizable beneath layers of grime. Sometimes, during moments stolen between tasks, glances had been exchanged, tear tracks had been seen, glistening beneath dust. Nothing had ever been said. Language had become obsolete. In the corner cell opposite his own had been Gerald, a man with cataract-clouded eyes and trembling hands that clutched a silver bracelet too tightly, as if it had still pulsed with the warmth of the woman who once wore it. Gerald had spoken little, but his breathing had always been rhythmic, a tether to some past dignity that refused to die. And then there had been Mr. Wellers. That name had once belonged to someone human. Now it had been spoken only in hushed memories, laced with hate, a figure of laughter and cruelty, known for boasting about what had been taken: wives, children, limbs, light. He had walked among the workers as if untouchable, his voice thick with enjoyment as he described what had been done to Reuben's family. The screams had been remembered. His wife's name, Lena, had been reduced to a sound that could no longer be said without tasting iron. And the child, Matthew, a boy with soft hands and a breath too short to hold, had become the anchor of Reuben's every waking thought. Each night, before the lights had gone out, a call had echoed through the corridor: lights off. One voice, always the same, followed by silence so absolute it had rung in the ears. And then, the sobbing. It had not been loud. It had not been proud. It had been shared. 1,000 lost men, weeping into rags and rust, dreaming of warmth, of love, of forgiveness. Reuben had joined them, quietly, always, but joined nonetheless. Tears had flowed until they hadn't. One night, they had simply stopped. His body had forgotten how. That had been the night Gerald had vanished. No warning had been given. No sounds had betrayed the moment, just the absence. His bed, nothing more than a blanket and a mattress teeming with insects, had sat undisturbed. No commands had been issued. No bag had been pulled over Gerald's head. Only Reuben had been taken that day, and when he had returned, the cell had felt colder. Gerald's absence had carved an emptiness that no sound could fill. The silence across the cell had thickened, as if the air itself had grown denser, more resistant to breath. No one had said his name. No one had dared ask. But Reuben had noticed something. On the belt, where fresh meat was hurled and smashed, where sinew and bone had become indistinct under force, a glint of silver had passed by. A chain, a bracelet. It had not been new. The metal had been dulled, stained in spots with something blackened and dry, but its shape had been familiar. A small curve at the clasp, a nick just beneath the charm. Every mark had been known. Gerald's bracelet. No words had been formed. No breath had been caught. Only the motion of the hands had continued. The pounding, the pressing, the routine. But inside Reuben's chest, a slow fire had begun to grow. Numbness had once been a shield. Now it had become a cage. The cell had felt too large without Gerald's coughing. The nights had stretched too long without the sound of his quiet sobbing. That bracelet had meant something. It had been the last thread to someone real, someone broken. Yes, but someone still whole in the places that mattered. And now it had been processed, ground, flattened, buried in gristle and noise. Time had continued without form. Drip, drip, drip. That had been the rhythm. Not seconds, not hours, just the water line from the corner of the ceiling. Always leaking, always cold. Food had arrived each day, coated in dirt, served on trays that reeked of rot. Reuben had eaten it, not from hunger, but to exist, to keep breath flowing, to keep blood moving, to survive long enough for something. At night, the sirens had returned, always red, always pulsing, light that painted the cells in fever tones. And sometimes the voice of Wellers had echoed in the distance, laughing, bragging, of Lena, of Matthew, of the moment the bat had broken bone, of how screams had been silenced. Reuben had buried his face beneath the tattered blanket and waited for morning. He had begged, not for forgiveness, not for justice, but for silence. Just one day without memory, one day without his son's empty eyes. But the begging had gone unanswered. Tears had once come easily. Now they had refused. Scratched eyes had remained dry. The ducks had failed. Even the pain had felt artificial. A performance of grief, not the thing itself. Had he become the monster? That thought had lingered. He had remembered the words once used against him. Cattle, machine, product, and somewhere inside, something had shifted. He had whispered apologies, though they had not passed his lips. Inside his skull, the phrases had looped. For Lena, for Matthew, for Gerald, for himself. And that night, a change had arrived. It had started with footsteps, different ones, heavier, frantic. Then the scream, then the echo, then the pop of a gunshot that had shaken the air like thunder in a tomb. Then more. Gunfire, shouts, boots, sirens. A battle had begun just beyond the corridor. The walls had trembled. The ceiling dust had fallen. Lights had blinked and burned red. A flash of chaos had surged, and in its center something had moved. Down the corridor, a shadow had sprinted, not dressed in uniform, not masked, just a figure, searching, turning, checking doors, hesitating, and then the figure had stopped. In front of Reuben's cell, a key had been raised. Metal had caught the red light. The lock had turned, and Reuben had waited, shoulders tensed, expecting the bag, expecting the shove. But no words had been spoken. No bag had been pulled. Instead, a grunt had come from the far corner of the cell, the place where Gerald had once slept. The figure had collapsed. Breath labored, bleeding, A trail of red had followed him. His head had bowed low. His voice had issued a command meant to dismiss. But Reuben had recognized that voice. That same voice that had laughed at pain, that had bragged about blood, that had spoken about Lena as if she were nothing, that had told him his son had been just another body, Weller's. And in that moment, something inside Reuben had broken and reformed. The flashing lights had strobed through the bars, washing the cell in waves of red and shadow. Reuben had stood over the crumpled figure, unmoving at first, his breath caught between disbelief and rage. The floor had trembled beneath the hum of chaos outside. But within that room, time had slowed to a painful crawl. Weller's had bled, from the side, from the mouth, from beneath a torn sleeve. A trail had formed across the mattress once claimed by Gerald, and the scent, metallic, rich, human, had filled the cell like a kind of offering. Reuben had approached slowly. Each step had been deliberate. Each breath had been drawn with purpose. His right hand, the prosthetic once splintered and unstable, had hung like a weight of memory, and when the light had caught Weller's face just right, the features had been seen clearly. That face, that smirk, that jaw that had once clenched in pleasure while describing Lena's final moments. Something had broken. The scream had not been heard. It had been released, a sound too old, too deep to be born of lungs. It had erupted from the throat, like a flood from a cracking dam, a cry not of sorrow, but of revenge. What followed had not been clean, not controlled. The wooden arm had been raised and brought down, again, and again, and again. The pointed splinter where the palm once was had been driven through muscle, through cloth, through resistance. Blood had soaked into the mattress. Bones had cracked. Pleas, if they had been made, had not been heard. Weller's had fought, but not well. The years of indulgence, the rot of cruelty, the arrogance of impunity, none had shielded him. The prosthetic had shattered further, but the jagged wood had held long enough. Reuben's flesh-covered hand had done the rest. Flesh had been torn, eyes had been removed, the jaw had been split open and left to hang in a grotesque angle. His legs had been snapped like green twigs. A single shot had been fired, a desperate attempt from Weller's sidearm. It had missed, or perhaps it had struck the wooden limb, which had finally splintered completely, leaving only a shard like a spike protruding from Reuben's elbow. That spike had found its way into Weller's skull. The moment had arrived, not with triumph, but with stillness, the kind of stillness that followed storms, and then laughter from Reuben's own lips. But it had not sounded like joy. It had not even sounded like madness. It had sounded like release. He had remained over the body for what had felt like hours, watching the color fade from the skin, the breath halt, the monster reduced to meat. Then the shouting had returned. Footsteps, flashlights, armor, weapons. The door had burst open, and masks had entered, eyes wide with horror, with revulsion, with confusion. Guns had been raised, then slowly lowered. Reuben had been taken without resistance. He had not spoken. He had not needed to. The scene had spoken for itself, and the look on his face had not been one of regret. The aftermath had unfolded in silence. The cell had been left behind. The body had been bagged. The facility, now exposed, had been flooded with search teams, cameras, officials. Stories had emerged of missing persons, of human trafficking, of underground labor camps thought to be relics of wartime. The world had pretended to be shocked. Reuben had not spoken a word for 3 days. Examinations had been performed, photographs taken, interrogations held, but he had remained still, blank-faced, not uncooperative, just absent, as if part of him had been left behind with Weller's shattered skull, and that mattress soaked with a decade of other men's pain. The court case had never come. Self-defense, they had said, temporary insanity. Others had insisted. The truth had been messier, too human for headlines. The charges had been dropped. No time had been served, but freedom had not been granted. Not really. 2 months had passed. A small apartment had been provided. White walls, government-issued bedding, a chipped coffee mug, and a plastic spoon. The refrigerator had hummed too loud. The silence between its cycles had been worse. The world had moved on, but Reuben had remained in place. Lena had not returned. Matthew had not been found. Their absence had become louder in the quiet than it ever had behind bars. No friends had visited. No calls had been received. The neighbors had looked at him like a storm cloud hovering too close to their doorsteps. His name had been whispered, then buried. His existence had become something others tried to forget. And still, each morning, he had awakened to the sound of a phantom buzzer in his ear, the sound of a bulb outside a cell door flickering to life. Each night, he had laid beneath a clean blanket, but only the weight of dirt and grief had kept him warm. He had written nothing. Until now, the post had not been crafted for fame. It had not been made to shock. It had been created as a grave marker, typed into the void, not as confession, but as testimony that monsters had existed, that some had worn uniforms, that some had laughed while they broke the world, that he too had become something else inside that cage. The story had ended with a goodbye, not a cry for help, not a call for justice, just a farewell and a final line, typed with the last strength left in a ruined hand. Another day, another night,